Sunday, November 3rd. My name is Zach, and it's been 2 days since my brother Dan left for work. My parents left home for a vacation, but we knew that it was because they didn't want to clean all the eggs splattered on their house after Halloween. I was then home alone with my sister Melanie and my 16-year-old brother Dan. The day my parents left, Dan had to go to work in a large hotel. He hasn't come back since Tuesday, and whether he'll return or not is anyone's guess. I hope he's okay, because I don't know what I'd do without him. Monday, November 4th. Dan came back today. He was holding a large portrait, and when I asked him where he got it, he claimed he'd found it sometime after entering the hotel's elevator. Apparently, the elevator kept descending beyond where Dan wanted to go, and took him into a strange area. Supposedly, it looked both familiar and unfamiliar simultaneously, which didn't make sense to me. Dan explored for a long time, and eventually found a portrait. "The portrait took me home," Dan said to me, yet he refused to elaborate on how it took him home. He looked at the portrait in admiration. "I love it." The portrait itself was very off-putting. It was a hand-drawn picture of one of those weird bears I've seen on the news, but it appeared to be in a heavy state of decay. I didn't get to look that long at it, as Dan then ran to his room, never breaking eye contact with the portrait, and locks the door. I looked at Melanie, who seemed confused. I was confused too. Was this some elaborate prank? Dan didn't leave his room for the rest of the day. I tried looking through the hole in his door lock multiple times, but I couldn't make out anything. I could hear indistinct mumbling coming from within the room, but not much else. Even when the sun set and nighttime arrived, Dan never left his room, never ate dinner, and never went to see us. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't concerned for him. Tuesday, November 5th. I turned on the TV and switched to the news channel. Apparently, multiple people were killed within their homes last night in this very city. I didn't think there were any connections between the murders and Dan's portrait fetish at first, but after doing some research, I'm not so sure now. I decided to look up Dan's descriptions of the familiar/unfamiliar place he described, and found some results. Supposedly, a rumor exists that describes a mysterious area called Anamoya. It fit Dan's description like a piece of a jigsaw puzzle. To try and summarize it, somebody named Shiro Ito went into an elevator within a hotel, and the elevator continued to descend, taking him into a strange location that resembled an amalgamation of his memories. Shiro never escaped, but according to legend, the longer he was in there, the more he changed. Years went by, and Shiro transformed into a horrible monster that kills anybody who dares enter its domain. Now, I know that sounds ridiculous, and you're right, it does, but upon looking up information related to the murders that happened last night, I started to wonder if there was any truth to the story. Apparently, 7 people were murdered, 6 men and 1 woman. What I found curious about the murders was that all the men who died looked eerily similar to Dan. Speaking of Dan, he's still in his room. I haven't seen him leave once, which makes me wonder how he's even alive, since he likely hasn't eaten in days. I remembered the gruesome portrait I'd seen yesterday. Could that be the monster described in the rumors? The rumors never specified if the monster resembled a bear, and whether it was rotting or not. But Dan's story matched Anamoya so perfectly. If the portrait depicted the monster, who drew it? Was it a self-portrait? If it was a self-portrait, why was it just lying around? These questions continue to haunt me, but I have no chance of getting any answers yet, so I'll leave them be. For now. Wednesday, November 6th. I turned on the news again. More murders. Only this time, they were a lot closer to my house. I needed to see that portrait again, to see if it resembled Ito in any way, but first, I looked up an image of Shiro Ito. There were only a few pictures of Ito, and he looks the same in all of them, worn out, with black hair and a white shirt. "He kind of looks like you," a voice said from behind me. It was Melanie. "What are you doing?" "Just investigating," I replied. "Remember that portrait Dan's obsessed with? I think it may be connected to rumors surrounding this city." "Cool," Melanie said. "I need to see the portrait," I said. "Maybe then I could see why Dan's so into it." "Maybe he's in love with it," Melanie said. "What kind of weirdo would consider a rotting animal attractive?" I asked. "Anyways, can you help?" "Sure, what can I do?" Melanie asked. "I'll need you to lift me up to the window outside Dan's room," I explained. "That way I can get in. Maybe taking it from him will stop his obsession." "I can try," Melanie said. Sometime later, Melanie gave me a boost upwards, and I climbed into Dan's room from the window. I looked at Dan. He looks terrible. His skin was pale from the lack of sunlight, and he had become skinny to the point where his ribcage looked like it would break through his skin. His eyes were dry and bloodshot, with veins that looked like they would burst. Dan stared into the portrait. He'd been doing this for days. No food, no sunlight, nothing but a horrible portrait to keep him company. The portrait itself was even worse now that I could clearly see it. The portrait was a bear. The bear's ribcage was exposed, with multiple rips in its skin exposing what was presumably black flesh. Its right eye was completely missing, and the left eye dangled out. It also had what looked like hundreds of dangerous sharp teeth. Whatever it was, it stopped being Shiro Ito years ago. Dan, I said, are you okay? Shh, Dan replied. It's singing to me. It's lovely. You're drowning it out. No, it isn't, I said. Give it to me. No, Dan replied. Please, I begged. Dan didn't respond. His fingers twitched, as though he wanted to tell me to be quiet but was too busy holding the portrait to bother. I tried grabbing the portrait off him, and it drops to the floor. I tried to throw it out the window, but Dan grabbed my hand, threw me to the floor, and punched me in the eye multiple times. He then kicked my ribcage, grabbed me by the shirt, and threw me out the window. I held on by one hand. Melanie, help me! I cried. Melanie ran into the house. Dan grabs the portrait. This is mine, not yours, he said. Dan then slams the window in my hand, and I let go. I could have sworn I saw a hint of regret on Dan's face as I fell, but that quickly changed back into obsessing over the painting. I landed on something soft. Melanie must have grabbed the air mattress that was usually saved for guests. I tried to get up, but I couldn't. Instead, I sobbed for what felt like hours. My brother used physical violence against me, someone he'd known for years, over a portrait. What happened? Melanie asked. She looked shocked, but I couldn't answer her. All I could do was cry. Thursday, November 7th. I was awoken by a violent knock on the door. Oh, I thought, it must be Dan's boss, telling him he's missed days of work. I wasn't sure how I'd explain Dan's obsession to him. But when I looked out of the window to see who was there, it wasn't Dan's boss. It was something inhuman. The thing saw me and ran away. I didn't see where it went because I was too horrified to bother checking. That face looks just like the thing on Dan's portrait. That's when it all clicked for me. This was the thing who murdered all those people. It must have seen Dan in Anamoya, followed him out, and somehow lost him on the way. Those people who died, the monster thought they were Dan. It wanted its portrait back. I heard sounds of claws digging into bricks. The creature was trying to find another way in. I locked all the windows, making sure there was nowhere it could enter. I also went to light the fireplaces. I wasn't sure if its flesh could burn, but if this thing used to be Shiro, it'd have to stay away. I heard noises from within Melanie's room when locking her window. What's up? Melanie asked. She'd recently woken up. Something's here, I said. What? Melanie said, her voice a mix of surprise and confusion. The clawing sounds continued, and I even saw the creature looking at me through one of the locked windows. Its eyes penetrated no emotion but malice. It kept clawing, climbing upwards. That's when I realized Dan's window was unlocked. Melanie, follow me, now, I said, grabbing her hand. We went outside. Lift me up! Melanie lifted me up slowly. Her hands wobbled. I jumped and barely grabbed onto the window. I climbed inside. The creature had already made it in. Dan was a bloodied mess. His arms were bleeding with what looked like claw marks. He had a black eye, but there was so much blood I struggled to make it out. The other victims of this creature all died from slit throats, but Dan didn't have any damage near the throat. Now that the creature knew it had Dan, the person who took its only belonging from it, it wanted to make Dan's death as painful as possible. The creature somehow looked even worse than it did in the portrait. It was more flesh than skin, and it had multiple fleshy tendrils protruding out of it. The thing was covered with tumors and had sharp claws in its right hand. The other hand had been reduced to a giant spiky tendril. I could barely even make out its face, but it seemed to have 3 eyes, and only half of its mouth remained. However, I couldn't see the portrait anymore. Dan must have heard the creature coming, presumably thinking it was me, and hid it somewhere. The creature looked at me. Ito? I said. The creature's eyes widened in surprise, but that surprise turned into anger. It pounced toward me, aiming its left tendril at me, and I dodged. Where is the portrait? I asked Dan. "No, don't take it from me. It's mine, don't take it," Dan hissed. Dan then looked at my left eye, at the bruise he'd caused, then at the creature. He took a deep, painful breath, and a single tear came out of his eye. "What have I done?" Dan then pointed to a pillow. I ran to the pillow, lifted it up, and grabbed the portrait. I could hear the song Dan loved so much. I don't remember much of it, but it sang of the sky raining the blood of life upon us. I tried to ignore it, but it felt like it was climbing into my brain like a disease. I held out the portrait towards Ito. The mangled creature stopped and looked at it, then at me. I slowly moved toward Ito, holding out the portrait. Ito reached its remaining arm out and grabs the portrait. It looked at the portrait for a few seconds, then at me. It stared at me for what felt like minutes, and in that moment, the violence in its eyes vanished. He then turned away, exited out the window, and disappeared. I turned to Dan. Tears leaked out of his eyes. "I'm sorry," Dan said. "I don't know why I let it take me over, why I let it hurt you, why I hurt you, but I didn't want to." I pulled Dan up and hugged him. I understood even though it hurt. I remembered the creature from earlier, the way it looked at me. Melanie was right. I did look like Ito.